My name is Joe Poor. I am the city engineer for the city of Golden. Along with me from the city tonight are Rick Murby and Corey Miller from our Planning and Economic Development Department. Wanted to thank you very much for joining. We very much appreciate the feedback that we get in these public meetings, and this is the first public meeting for this Colfax project. So very much looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Kind of focus tonight on the goals and outcomes of the project, what you guys want to see, as outcomes, and less focused on specific solutions. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Leah Langerman and let her and her team lead us through the presentation.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to discuss the future of US 40, or the West Colfax Avenue corridor from Violet Street to I-70. So like Joe mentioned, this is our first public meeting, and I'm with David Evans and Associates. My name is Leah Langerman, and I'll be facilitating this evening. And we will spend the first portion of the meeting going through a presentation. We'll review what this project is all about and describe the existing and forecasted conditions we're working with. We did split the corridor into segments because of their varying character. So we'll discuss elements of the potential cross-section for each of those segments. And during that portion of the meeting, we'll ask your opinion using some interactive polling. So if possible, please have your smartphones or even another web browser page open on your computer or your tablet. And then I'll give you more instructions about that when we get to that point. So during this presentation, you may have already noticed, everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but I will allow you to unmute yourselves during the group discussion in the second half of the meeting. So at that time, I'll review any questions that have come through in the chat and then open it up to hear from you directly. So we are recording this, and it'll be available on the city's webpage through Guiding Golden. And hopefully that'll be tomorrow, but comments will be open through August 12th. So we're welcoming all comments tonight, but you don't have to tell us everything that you'd like to say tonight. If you think of something later or you have a question afterwards, feel free to visit that project webpage, and then you can get more information that way or submit comments. So the webpage is guidinggolden.com/US40. As Joe mentioned, tonight we're really focused on the broad outcomes, and we want to understand what you value most here. We know that you might have certain issues like a specific pothole that's really been bothering you or something like that, but feel free to send us comments about those kinds of things in the chat or through Guiding Golden, but we won't be focusing on that kind of thing tonight. So in case somebody isn't familiar with Zoom, in order to use the chat feature, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a toolbar, and then you should see a little conversation bubble icon. And just click on that and you can chat us anytime during the presentation. Okay, that was a ton of logistics, so I'm sure that's enough, but next I'll introduce our presenters. Sarah Siasto is our project manager with David Evans and Associates, and she'll be speaking next in the presentation. And you'll also hear from Hannah Polo, who is a planner, and she'll also be helping us through those interactive polls that I talked about. So Sarah, would you please start us off with the project intro?
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. I'm going to pile on to what Joe and Leah said. Just want to welcome you all to this conversation, as we are really excited to get this discussion going and really excited to talk with you all. Again, stealing from the branding, to talk with you all about the future of US 40. So we wanted to start, Leah's talked a little bit about project limits, but we want to start by kind of grounding us and looking at a picture of this project area. So the project corridor is for this section of Colfax Avenue or US 40, could go by either, really starting at Violet Street, which is just east of C470, and coming around the corner at Heritage and all the way down to I-70 near the dinosaur lots. So we're tracking that whole corridor as part of this project. Obviously, the section of the corridor includes a handful of key intersections, including the ones that are listed here on the slide: Rooney, Heritage, Martin Marietta, and then the everything going on around the interchange, with I-70 near those dinosaur lots. We're going to keep on moving here and talk about some corridor challenges. So before we start talking about what we're going to do, it's important to kind of understand where we're at, right? And so this corridor is an interesting mix. It's a recreational corridor. It serves residential areas, and it's also serving industrial and commercial uses. It has multiple destinations, you all know this, and a very interesting mix and varied types of users that use the corridor. So there's a lot of things for us to be looking at as we start talking about what does US 40 look like as we keep moving. So what are we going to do? That's all great, right? But what are we actually going to tackle here in the US 40 project? So we're looking at existing and forecasted conditions, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. We're just trying to ground what is going on out there right now and what are the plans for what's going to happen on the corridor and around the corridor in the future. We are going to take a look at roadway alternatives, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we keep going through this tonight, both the development of those alternatives and the evaluation, really with the focus on providing improved multimodal connections kind of along this corridor. And then as we get through the alternatives process, we'll take those into preliminary and final design and really build them into a project that we can go support you all and the city in getting constructed. What's going to be really important in all of these efforts is this ongoing conversation, starting with the conversation we're having tonight, starting with some of those comments we're seeing on the idea wall on Guiding Golden. We want to make sure we're having this discussion with you as we go along, and that starts with these community values. We started our whole process and our whole thought around this golden vision for 2030. We want to build from these values, and these values actually are a really awesome fit, provide a really awesome connection to the kinds of things that we want to do on this US 40 corridor. We're also going to start by looking at things you all have been a part of pretty recently, namely the South Golden Neighborhood Plan. We've been talking about a lot of previous planning efforts as background information feeding into what we're going to do here with US 40. And this plan, particularly because it was just late last year that the city came to you with some initial conversations about this. Part of that was generating these lists that you see here. And this one is for Violet to Zeta, and kind of this general list of desired improvements that you all told the city you were interested in. The next slide shows that same input for the section of 40 from Zeta all the way down then to the dinosaur lots. So what's important about this, and what we wanted to make clear, and I think we've kind of beat this up a little bit as we've gotten started, but we want to be clear that we're really building from the information that you've provided previously. We're listening to what you have said before, and we're going to use that as we move forward. With that, we're going to take a quick pause, and we're going to move right into our first polling activity through Mentimeter to build on that input from the neighborhood plan. So Hannah's going to walk us through that.
Actually, I will.
Oh, sorry, Leah will.
That's okay. It's okay. We're taking turns tonight. So this is our first interactive question. So let's test this all out here. And this is actually a very important question. So please use that information you see on the very top of the screen to participate. So you can use your smartphone or open another web browser, but go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and then type in the code. So the code is 96747518. So that should bring you to our presentation, and then it'll allow you to interact as we ask questions. So just keep this open on whatever you've pulled it up on, and after we get back into our presentation, we'll have another portion where we're asking you some more questions on here. So I see one person's already gotten it, so that's great. Some of you might be familiar with this, but hopefully you all find it. It's very easy, and it's a really slick way for us to see what people are thinking in real time. So just as you're doing already, complete this sentence. This project will be successful if it, and we'll see these responses scrolling on the screen as more get entered. You also should be able to submit more than one answer for this one. Later in the questions, there'll be multiple choice where we're asking for your favorite of something, but here you can submit more than one answer, but usually the first thing that comes to your mind is probably the thing that's most important to you. So let's see, I'll read some of these out since people joining by phone wouldn't be able to see this screen, but let's see, if it makes Colfax multimodal, if it achieves the Golden community goals, serves the community more than serving the developers, focusing on the residents and businesses in the neighborhood, keeping with the values that you've all already told us about. We know that is really important, and definitely please know that we're already starting with all of that input that you've given as our baseline. So we're not starting from scratch here. Anything that you have already told us is really important to you is being considered already, but this is helping us as we possibly include some new people. Safer with traffic calming, also thinking about the wildlife that obviously is very important on this corridor. Connecting surrounding neighborhoods is something that we have already heard a lot about. That is one of the things that we'll be looking at later in the presentation. We're more focused today on project elements of the cross section, but connections is a very important piece of this project that we will be getting into later. Okay, pedestrian and bicycle access, all kinds of good things. So even once we move to the next slide, as long as you stay on that slide on your phone or on the web browser that you're on, you can keep entering comments if you'd like. And even if I didn't read your comment, it's all important. It will all be compiled, and our team will look at all of these after the meeting and make sure that we're including all the comments. So there'll be a little bit before we get back to our next poll question. So if you want to keep that open, we will. We can head on to our next slide, and Sarah can take us into the existing and forecasted conditions.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for all that input. It looked like we had about 40 to 45 responses before we moved on. So to Leah's point, keep them coming. It's really awesome to capture this as we're moving along. Really awesome to capture it as you're thinking about it, right? So I'm going to keep chatting at you, but don't be shy about going back and putting in some additional thoughts as you think of them. So while we assume that most of you have a pretty good understanding of the project area, I wanted to just kind of zip quickly through a summary of the kind of existing conditions data that we've been working on gathering to really inform this alternatives and then the design process. So we're going to start with the geography. You all know this, right? The corridor is partially located behind the hogback. You've got the next range of the foothill peaks, moving up to the west. This is obviously a City of Golden project, but US 40 is also under CDOT jurisdiction. We also have Jefferson County open space in the area as well. So there's a coordination effort here for several agencies as we start the conversation about what makes sense down here. Keep trucking, Hannah, if you don't mind. Again, you all know this, but the corridor serves as a connection to several major transportation facilities, right? We're talking about connections to I-70, to 470, to 6th Avenue, to Highway 93. The access, we saw it in your comments just now. We've seen it in the comments on the idea wall. We've seen it and heard it in everybody we've talked to so far on this project about the access to the open space, the access to the recreational destinations. We see kind of differing peaks sometimes in the traffic related to those sorts of things, but it's definitely providing a connection to really valuable community elements. And certainly then obviously serves local trips as well for the neighborhoods and other things. The land use, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but there's just a grand variety of land use along the corridor. We've talked about this, residential, commercial, industrial, kind of all present in addition to the recreational. There's this vision that's been developed out of the South Golden Plan, but there's also planned redevelopment coming, and you all have alluded to that in your comments as well. Most of those are driven by recreational opportunities, but it's good to just kind of, for us as the background, to know that this is all going on. Moving on to the next slide, we've got more obvious but good to note content. Some context here that we see a really incredibly diverse mix of users and modes. Your comments also alluded to that. We're seeing cyclists of a variety of levels. Pedestrians, obviously not so much down on the western or southern piece, but more up in the northern or eastern section. Obviously, commercial trucks and vehicles, that freight operation in and out of Martin Marietta, we understand is it's a thing that we need to be talking about. Personal automobiles, motorcycles, and it's just getting used by a lot of different types of users. All of those things really contribute to those existing conditions. And as with most transportation projects, we also have to dive a little bit more deeply into the vehicular traffic, right? We need to understand what's going on with the cars on the road. So this is a whole bunch of data. It will all be available. That graphic's a little small, I understand that, but you'll be able to zoom into it when you see it on Guiding Golden. But I'll walk you through kind of the basics here. So we completed traffic counts back in May. What was interesting, so that's just a couple months ago, right? What was interesting is that we saw that data was pretty consistent with pre-pandemic levels. So we're seeing, you all are experiencing it too, right? We're seeing this rebound in vehicular traffic. The weekday volumes were higher than weekend volumes. It was something we wanted to look at. We didn't know if the recreational use would drive a higher volume on the weekends or keep the kind of standard weekday peak. And between 5 to 20% higher is what we're seeing on the weekdays as opposed to the weekends. It's obvious, but it's good to document that we're seeing much higher truck volumes from the Martin Marietta access points to the south. It's pretty obvious, but it's good to know what we're looking at. We're also looking at taking that existing data and then finalizing it into the 2050 forecasts. And what those forecasts are showing out of the models, the regional models, is that the forecasted future traffic shows relatively low growth. In fact, remarkably different and lower than what we would see kind of across the region. It's notable. It's showing less growth along US 40 in traffic than we would see elsewhere. And what it results in is about 10,000 vehicles a day. If anybody's really into the numbers, that's where we're at. So no matter what we do, we always have to keep safety in front of it. And I love that we were seeing some of that response in your targets for this as well. Again, lots of data on this slide, information that will be available that you can go in and zoom in and take a peek at. But what we are seeing is more significant crash patterns really in that northern to eastern half, we'll call it, of the corridor than we are seeing in the southern part. You can see here, 80 total crashes, most common are rear end and broadside. We do have a handful of fatals in the last 5 years, so we are looking at the details of how that happened. Notably, I would say that we did not identify a trend in the available crash data, and that came from both Jefferson County and CDOT, related to crashes related to the truck traffic. And they thought that was worth noting, so that it wasn't something where we were seeing a significant trend around trucks and that heavy vehicle traffic really driving crash instances. So it's a whole bunch of existing information. What are we going to do with all of that? So for us, just to kind of organize our approach to this, we've taken the corridor that we've shown you and broken it into 3 segments. And you can kind of see those here. Limits, less important, is just being able to see kind of how we've looked at this. So one is from Violet to Zeta, really kind of through that more urbanized section that exists right now. The next one runs from Zeta around the corner at Heritage down to the northern entry point. So before you get to really the access locations for Martin Marietta. And then we picked up that 3rd segment and ran it through kind of the more freight focused, where we see the bigger freight numbers from the Martin Marietta accesses down to the southern project limit at I-70. So from here, as Leah alluded to earlier, Hannah's going to jump in and really just walk through a process here around some of the preliminary ideas we've generated. And this is where your involvement is going to come back in terms of Menti. So if you put your phone aside, you might want to pick that back up, and I'll let Hannah dive in.
Awesome. So sometimes I come through kind of quiet. So please, if you can't hear me, say something in the chat, and I will be sure to speak up a little bit because I want to make sure that you're able to hear me. So I'm going to give an overview of all the components that we're considering for improvements as part of the cross-section for this project. And so I'll go through a bunch of different options, and then in a little bit, we'll ask your preference for those specific segments that Sarah had just talked about. Your you're welcome to take notes if you want, but I'll remind you of the elements. So you don't have to memorize everything. I'll remind you of the elements that that we have up on the screen that we want you to choose your preference for. And I will be explaining them maybe in more detail than some of you need, but bear with me because I really want everyone to kind of understand kind of these elements as much as possible, so that when we ask for your preferences, you'll be able to really give us an informed decision. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is a shared. Oh, and I see in the chat. Oh, yep, awesome. Menti chat, the Menti code, and I'll bring that up on the screen again as well. But it is in there. So the shared bike curb lane is really just that. It's a shared lane between vehicles and bicyclists. You can see that bike symbol with the two arrows is what we call a sharrow, and it's general guidance for where the bicyclist should go, but it's not a separated space for bicyclists. So it really is a shared lane. This is a curb lane, so it is immediately next to the curb. It's not an inside travel lane, and it's a little wider than a normal travel lane. So here you can see it's at least 14 feet wide. So an enhanced shoulder, we've got two examples here, and the difference here is the width of the shoulder. So that's the only difference between these, but we thought it was helpful to just kind of see how that 2 additional feet can really feel like a big difference. So the example shown here, the shoulder is wider than maybe a typical shoulder of 3 to 5 feet. So we have 8 or 10 feet shown here. And then we have a really defined edge line, so that white stripe. And then we also have rumble strips to the right of that edge line. So the next thing is the bike lanes. And so this is out on Washington Street. There's a great example of a bike lane. And so there is a designated space for bicyclists. And so they are separated from vehicles. We've got a couple different variations here, but kind of the main points here is there is a minimum of 4 to 5 feet, depending on whether there's a curb and gutter. But a bike lane can go up to 8 feet wide if there's high volumes or if there's a lot of different speeds of bicyclists, and we want to have space to allow passing of slower bicyclists. So now we get into kind of the enhanced bike lanes. So the graphic on the left is a buffered bike lane, and the one on the right is a protected bike lane. So the one on the left, this buffered bike lane, so the bike lane and the travel lane are separated by striping. So 2 white lines with that hatching in between. So it really creates this almost this dead space where bicyclists and vehicles are not traveling. So it really creates that space, and it's much more comfortable for bicyclists to ride. The example on the right, the key difference here is there's a vertical element in that buffer. So here you can kind of see it's kind of a bird's eye view, but it's a guardrail. But it could be a number of different things: plastic delineators or candlesticks, some people call them, or a curb. The key thing here is that there's some vertical element to make that space a little bit more established, to keep bicyclists and vehicles separated. I think we're about halfway through, so stay with me. And this is an easy one. This one we know. I know it seems kind of silly to put a travel lane in here, but it is a very important part of the cross section. And just want to note that we will be looking at an 11 or 12 foot travel lane, and that's just going to depend on the other elements that we're putting together and how wide we want to have the cross section. Okay, multi-use paths. So we've got a couple different examples here. The very top example on the left is kind of a shared multi-use path. So there's no clear delineation for where bicyclists or pedestrians should be. It's for everyone. An example of this is right along 6th Avenue. There's a great multi-use path. The middle example is it's a little wider and it's got that center line. So it's a clearer delineation for where the directional travel, where people should be going. And then the final example on the right is kind of the deluxe version, where it's much wider. It's 16 feet wide, and there's a separate area, a separate two-way bike facility, and then pedestrians are separated from the bikes. So that's really helpful if there's a high volume of bicyclists and or pedestrians. All of these components are off the street. So that's a really important thing to note. They are not with the vehicles, with the travel lanes. Do want to note that sometimes it can get a little confusing for drivers at driveways because they are then looking for people going in both directions, because that's how these multi-use paths allow travel. But they are off street, and that allows a really improved experience for bicyclists and pedestrians. Sidewalks, I think we're all pretty familiar with sidewalks, but the one thing I want to point out here is the difference between an attached sidewalk and a detached sidewalk. So this lower right example is an attached sidewalk. So that sidewalk is immediately next to that travel lane. And then the other two examples are detached. So there's a little bit of space between the travel lane and the sidewalk, making it just much more comfortable for that pedestrian. Another thing that can improve the environment for pedestrians is having some sort of amenity zone or a tree lawn. And so this is between the sidewalk and the travel lanes. And it could be, there could be benches, there could be trees as shown in this concept. There's some kind of brick pressure fine design here as well. And it just creates more protection for those pedestrians. Okay, this is our last one. And then get ready for Menti again. So medians are there can be a number of widths with a median. And the 4 to 6 foot medians really don't provide a pedestrian refuge. So a place for pedestrians and bicyclists to wait in the middle of the intersection, whereas the 12-foot raised median really does create a comfortable space to wait in the middle of an intersection. This can be really effective in unsignalized crossings or mid-block crossings, and that can create a really important crossing that maybe isn't there today. One thing about raised medians is it can change access. So obviously making left turns is a little bit more, should not happen with raised medians. And so it does affect and change the access point. Okay, so now we're gonna go back into Menti and we're gonna focus just on segment 1. So I'm going to go into our Menti. So again, you can go to that website. And if you're following along, you should be on this screen. And I just want to say you can only vote once. Before you submit your answer, you can only vote once on one device. So if there's two of you that are watching together, you might want to grab another tablet or computer or phone. And so we really want to know for segment 1, which is between Violet and Zeta, what is your preferred bike facility? Is it a shared curb lane? So that's shared with vehicles. The enhanced shoulder is separated from vehicles. And then we have a number of different bike lane variations. So kind of the conventional bike lane, which is out on Washington Street, or the bike lane with a striped buffer, or bike lane with a vertical barrier. Okay, so definitely, and we've got, this is fun, it's like a race. Oh, pictures again? Sure, yeah. Yeah, I can definitely do that. Yeah, so here's a bike lane. So no space between the travel lane and where the bikes are going, the bike lane. So here's where there's a buffered bike lane on the left. So there's that striped separation, and then a protected bike lane on the right is got some kind of vertical element. And then multi-use path, which is not on the, it's not on the list for this one. Is that right, Leah? I think I'm.
Can you go back to the shared, the first one, the shared, because that was.
Oh, yes.
His shoulder.
Thanks,
The
Sarah.
shared lane.
Yep, I missed these. Sorry, Claire, who asked the question. So this is enhanced shoulder. So a wider shoulder with that defined edge line and rumble strips. And a shared bike curb lane with that shared space between bicyclists and vehicles. Cool. And I'll just kind of go slowly through them for anyone else. Travel lane. And right now we are just talking about bicyclists. I want to say that we will ask, the next question is about pedestrians, which is where we'll ask your preference there too. Okay, so it looks like we've got about 24 folks. So, okay, you're unable to vote. Okay, let's see.
Doing a little Menti triage on the fly. Good
Yep,
work.
let's see. I'm gonna, Helen can't vote, so I'm gonna try to vote for her.
Okay. Also, if you're able to pull up Menti, but you're just not seeing this question, you may need to refresh your screen. And you can do that either depending on what kind of phone you have by pulling down your phone from the top or hitting that refresh button. That might work. But it would go past this if you had logged an answer. So then we'd be on to the next question. And you can also put your preference into the Zoom chat if Menti isn't working for you.
That's
and
it, yes.
Either way, we can tally up all the answers at the end.
Okay, I will. Okay, I am voting. Helen, your answer has been recorded. Okay, so I think we'll continue on, but you are still able to vote once I move on. So this is similar to the previous question that we did. You'll still be able to vote even though I move on. But clear preference for a bike lane with some kind of separation from travel lanes, either with a striped buffer or with a vertical barrier. Okay, So now we're going to ask your preference for pedestrian accommodations. And this is where we have the question about the multi-use path. And again, you can only vote once, but if you're having troubles, like Leah mentioned, you can enter it into the Zoom chat, and we'll be able to register your vote there. And I am going to go back just for a second to show the multi-use path options. So these are the multi-use path options, with that lower right concept being the most robust option to separate bicyclists from pedestrians. Okay, we've got a couple questions. Should I?
Sure. Yeah, we might as well while people are answering this. So as far as the amenity of separation, that is something that we are not getting votes on, because if there is room and we would have space for that, we assume that that would be preferred. And why won't vertical separation get scraped off by snowplows? Hannah or Sarah, maybe that's something that you guys have experience with.
Depends on the type. Vertical separation definitely does introduce some challenges around maintenance and that sort of thing, right? So you're plowing against it and or plowing behind it. So that's definitely a consideration in terms of long-term maintenance for the city and for other things. So there are facilities, there are types of separation and barrier that can get down that aren't just going to get beat up and taken off by plows. It adds cost, it adds width, it adds all those things. So it's those part of those trade-offs that we'll be talking about as we get through this. So good questions.
There's one more question about, would a bike lane exist with a multi-use path?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
No, you go ahead, Hannah.
So this goes back to kind of a larger question with the trade-offs and what users we're serving. So an on-street facility often serves a very different type of user than someone who feels more comfortable using a multi-use path. Now, that being said, there are a lot of places with really restricted right-of-way. And in those places where we're thinking about the speed differential between bicyclists and pedestrians is pretty different, that's when we'd probably want to consider having a wider multi-use path and having enough space for the bicyclists to be on the path and not having on-street bike facilities.
There's also a question of if the detached sidewalk includes a bike lane. And
oh,
so
sorry.
That's okay. For this purpose, we're keeping those two things separate. That's part of what we'll do next after this meeting, is be packaging these individual project elements into alternatives and full cross sections. So that hasn't been determined yet, but for this question, we're just focusing on specifically for pedestrian accommodations, which of these options would you prefer? And then later we'll talk about combining or how we accommodate both bikes and peds.
Thanks, Leah. I'm trying to look at the chat too, so
yes,
I appreciate you.
Yeah, no problem.
building off that.
Okay, and
Okay.
there are some good comments coming in on the chat about this that are things that we'll consider as we're moving forward. But I think we could go to the next question.
Great. Okay. So we're still on segment 1. I think we'll be able to go faster on the other segments. We'll have the same questions for the next segments. So be thinking about what your vote is going to be. So which of the following options would increase your comfort and safety while crossing the roadway? So there's only 2 options here. So a raised median without the pedestrian refuge, or a wider raised median with pedestrian refuge to allow people to cross in 2 phases. So this is really thinking about, you know, would you prefer to cross the street all at once? Or would you prefer that there's a space to potentially wait if you're not able to get across the intersection all at once? And it looks like we have a strong contingency for pedestrian refuge at the moment. Okay, all right. Yeah, so it looks like we're at about half of all the folks who have voted before.
Claire was just asking, is there an option for no median at all? And you will see that segment 1 is actually the only time that this question will pop up for you because of the different characters of the segments. Segment 2 and 3 don't have a question about medians, and that likely wouldn't be something we would include in those segments.
And I'll add on to that just briefly that there's no, again, we're talking about concepts and ideas here, right? So there's no guarantee that someone's going to get a median, right? So this isn't even assuming that we're going to go that far. It's just asking what your thoughts would be about a type of median, should that be something that the project lands on for a recommendation. So not confusing at all.
Yeah. Yeah, we're pretty early in the process still, so hard to answer some of the questions. I know it's easy to jump to trying to think about how this will all look in the end, but we're not quite there yet.
And that's one of the reasons we have our concepts pretty conceptual, and we don't necessarily have them located in the place in the segments, because we're not, like Leah was saying, we're just not there yet. And so we're really thinking about them in the idea phase, opposed to actually locating them. Okay, looks like we've slowed down a little bit in the voting. So now we're going to go into segment 2. So now we're thinking about between Zeta and that northern Martin Marietta access point. And same questions, one vote allowed. And first question here is the bicycle facility, and the next question will be the pedestrian preference. And let me know if anyone has any, you know, in the chat box, if you want me to go back and refresh your memory. But that shared curb lane is really that shared space between vehicles and bicyclists, and that enhanced shoulder actually has a designated space for bicyclists that's separate from the vehicles. The bike lane is similar to what's on Washington Street, a separated space from the vehicles, similar to the enhanced shoulder. And then a bike lane with a striped buffer. So those 2 lines with hatching, and the bike lane with a vertical separation.
So a couple more comments and questions have come in. Someone's wondering if this would be in both directions.
Great. I would say great question, and something we're considering. It is not determined yet. Really, it's going to come down to the connectivity, the preference and options, and as with everything, we need to figure out how much improvement the project budget can buy, right? And so we're going to have to take a look at a lot of these kind of trade-offs or conversations around what's going to provide the best benefit for some of these improvements and work that into the discussion. So very much an evolving discussion around, would we put it on both sides? Would we just put it on one? You know, do we put bikes on both sides, but then just a pedestrian facility on one or the other? All kinds of things that we're exploring. Really the intent of today, as we've alluded to, is figuring out kind of what's going to feel most comfortable for you all out there as users. And then we'll start figuring out kind of how to blend that with the connections and the budget, of course, a little reality check, to see how we're going to be able to package these in a way that really provides the best bang for the buck.
I see, Jim, you asked if I want a multi-use path, why would I want a bike lane too? Some of these definitely are not combinations that would make sense together, but at this early stage, we're trying to get the overall big picture of 4 different modes of travel. Which accommodation do you like best? And then when we're packaging them, we'll definitely be considering what actually makes sense to put together.
Should I move on, Leah, or do we have more questions?
I think you could move on to the next one.
Okay.
And then we'll keep answering questions as they come.
Okay. Great. So similar to the first segment, we have a question about pedestrian accommodation. And so what would be your preferred pedestrian facility within segment 2? So again, that's from Zeta to the northern Martin Marietta access point. So we've got the 3 different multi-use path options, the detached sidewalk, so the sidewalk that's separated just a little bit from the travel lane, and the attached sidewalk, which is immediately next to travel lanes. Okay, so similar to what we were seeing before, kind of a preference for detached or multi-use path, whatever the variation is.
And David, that was a good comment about how this section has a lot of families, a lot of people that would be using this, that we really need to think about keeping safety in mind. And that's a really good point.
It's something that maybe we didn't touch on enough in the early part of the presentation, but that is something we as an internal team and with the city, we've talked about a lot, right? That, you know, we've all seen the road bikers out there who are comfortable in a different kind of situation. I would not take my kids on their bikes out there, right? And so how do we mix and match parts to provide better opportunities for users of a whole bunch of different levels of comfort, and acknowledging, particularly to your point, that this is an area where we may draw some of those families and other folks in who wouldn't be as comfortable, and we'd want to be looking for opportunities to really enhance that safety as much as possible. So that's definitely on our minds. Appreciate the reminder of that.
Hi, everybody. My name's Will. I'm helping out on the consultant side and wanted to answer one other question, and that was related to the solid line versus the 2 lines with the striping in the middle, and what's more effective in keeping drivers out. You know, I think from a notification standpoint that the the 2-lane configuration with the striping in the middle is a little less familiar for folks, and probably it would prevent more of that crossover. Now, I don't think that's not going to happen. People will do that to take right lanes. It's just something we need to be aware of. But between those two options, the double striped lane with the striping down the middle is more effective than just a single striping on the side, if you were to do just that horizontal separation that Hannah described earlier.
Okay, so looks like we've kind of leveled off in our voting. So I'm going to kind of move on, and we'll continue to answer questions as we go on to our last segment here. Same questions. Which on-street bicycle facility do you prefer for segment 3? So again, these are the same options that are available. And thanks for your patience and making sure we can get as many votes as possible. So looks like, yeah, we've got our bike lanes off to a strong start here.
Hannah, I'm just jumping real quick here. One thing to consider that we did notice during our observations out here, and this is a known quantity, obviously, is that this is a major transition point for some of those expert cyclists going up US 40. So that's something you'll want to consider when you're thinking about what treatment you'd like here. And of course, the large gravel trucks.
Yeah, I think when we were out there, we were out there for 2 hours, and I think we saw them like over 10 times. It was something, it was often, multiple times.
And during our site visit, we did hear from a family that would like to have some better connections from South Golden to Gateway Village here and the amenities that are being built. So that's another thing I just wanted to pass along.
Okay, looks like again we're kind of leveling off with our voting, so I'm going to go to our last question related to your preference with pedestrian accommodations for segment 3. So this northern Martin Marietta access to our southern project limits, which is the interchange with I-70. So you might have noticed the sidewalk options are not here. So for this segment, we're really considering multi-use path as the pedestrian accommodation.
And yet Jeremy brings up a good point. Just over the Hogback, the Tin Cup Ridge redevelopment is underway, and they're in conceptual design right now. And there is an idea of doing another concrete path on the east side of the Hogback there. So you can think of this as not just a one facility along a road, but maybe a system that suits a number of folks in the future. And as we move forward into developing a preferred alternative, we're going to take that into account and make sure that we're communicating with them to create a complete system.
Great. Again, we're kind of leveling off, so I will pass things off to talk about next steps.
Yeah, and we could tell you that those are all of our Menti questions for the night. So yeah. We put you through enough right now. Thank you all so much for all of that input. We'll definitely be pulling that down and poring over it in the next week or so. So thank you all for your help on that.
So I'll dive in and take us through a little bit of just some conversation around our next steps. We'll do a quick wrap up, and then we're going to open it up and just have a conversation. So we're almost done talking at you, I promise. Project schedule is shown here. Obviously, you can see we're in this kind of late July area with this public meeting. Really what's important, I'm going to reiterate some things we've been talking about, is that the input you've provided and will provide tonight and then over the next couple of weeks as you think of things is really going to help us immensely as we work through establishing those criteria against which we're going to evaluate the alternatives. And then again, as we build those alternatives into designs and move them forward into construction, it's really critical for us to hear what's important to you and what your preferences are. You heard us talk a little bit about this in this dialogue we've had over the last few minutes, but I think it's really important to recognize the trade-offs that have to come with some of these things. A trend that we were noticing kind of in the way that the votes were going, and it's obvious, right? Anything that's wider and provides more space immediately feels safer, right? More separation, more width, feels like you have more room to move, especially in a recreation kind of environment where you want that space to feel like you're really getting to enjoy it. The wider options, though, like that, do mean additional trade-offs, right? Some sort of separated facilities, like if we backtrack in our minds back up to segment 1, which is that area from Violet down to Zeta, when you think about separated facilities in there where we do have more accesses and property access and business access up there, a separated bike facility or something that has a barrier in there is going to provide a little bit of a challenge around making sure we're accommodating those access points, right? So there's these balanced conversations and these trade-offs that we need to discuss as we get into some of this stuff. So all of that is coming. There's also a question that popped up around the priority, right? So if you had to choose, you pick something over something else. That's also a really good one, and that's where some of those trade-offs are really going to come in our conversation too, kind of like what I was saying earlier, right? If we can get a improved facility on one side of the roadway, but maybe not have the space or the budget to do it on the other side, you know, maybe those are the kind of trade-offs that we get into in the way that we choose to prioritize. So we'll work with the agencies. We're certainly going to seek, you know, community and stakeholder input as we go through this. We've alluded to the fact that the ideas that are showing up on Guiding Golden have been really awesome. Everything you guys have mentioned to us tonight and we'll continue to dialogue about tonight is really incredible. Wanted to just kind of set the stage a little bit, and Leah's kind of alluded to this also. So we've been talking about these a lot about these linear alternatives, right? Like what's going on along the corridor. Equally as important is what's going on at the intersections and what's going on at those connection points to other facilities like the Tin Cup Bridge one that Jeremy and Will mentioned a minute ago. That's all coming as well. So I don't want you to think that we're forgetting about that, but we wanted to really be able to establish kind of what's happening along 40 to then inform how do we then connect, right? You have to know what's going on here before we figure out how we connect to all the other things going on in the area. So that's coming as well. Getting back to the schedule, we're going to come back to you in December-ish, maybe around the holidays. It's a little bit tough timing to try and squeeze in a public meeting, but we'll see kind of how things develop. Once we've gotten these recommended alternatives and taken them a little bit into design, right? So we get into the reality of, oh man, we need to worry about drainage or utilities or other adjacent things that are going on. And we'll present where we're at that point to you around the end of the year. At that point, we're absolutely going to be looking for your feedback and your ideas and input on that design before we finalize all the details and really take it into final design. We're looking at construction starting, you know, late summer this time next year. All kind of TBD depending on how some of the process related stuff has to go with the project. You see, Hannah, we can move to the next slide. You can see that engagement point listed here that I mentioned, but in the meantime, please don't be a stranger. We're certainly ready to have this discussion that we'll have in a minute, but if you have any other comments or thoughts, you know, please get them up to Guiding Golden. There's contact information here for Joe and for Leah. They can get to any of the rest of us. So you can go back and revisit anything you need to out of tonight's presentation and bring us any other ideas or comments you have. So from here, we're going to stop talking a little bit other than to respond to you and kind of open up the discussion. And I think Leah's going to facilitate us through that. So appreciate y'all being with us tonight.
Thanks. Yes, so I just allowed everyone to unmute. So hopefully everybody doesn't jump in at once, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have a question or something that you haven't already gotten answered in the chat, please speak now and we can we can help you with that.
I have two questions.
Sure, Ron.
Yes. First of all, nothing has been, mentioned here about commercial use. Without commercial use, none of these projects are possible because that's where the income is generated from. So I see all this, that's nice for shoulders and walkers and bicycles, but how does this interact with commercial use? We have a business in this corridor, and we've had it for a lot of years, and we feed several families out of it, so don't want that hampered. So where does it come in? That's one question. Can anyone answer that, I guess?
Well, first of all, we're very happy that you're joining us tonight because businesses are an extremely important stakeholder along this corridor, obviously. So one of the things that maybe Sarah can talk more about is that, business access and things like that are going to be something that we'll look at in our next steps. So Sarah, do you have anything else to add about that?
I can jump in, and then if anybody in the city wants to pile on, please feel free. I agree with Leah, Ron. Thank you for your question. I think it's an important clarification. If we go back in our heads to that traffic data that I talked about as part of the existing conditions, that's all related to cars and vehicles and the trucks and the actual vehicular access to the highway or into the roadway. We can't do any of this without that consideration, right? That it starts there, and then we start talking about how do we augment the facility for other types of users, but how do we really keep the focus on making sure that we are not hampering and not getting in the way of vehicular access, truck access, turning movements, driveways, property access. I can't say that there won't be conversations as we really get into the details about what this looks like, but that the consideration for cars and for business access and for truck operations in and out of properties and all of those things will be things that we will be looking at once we have an idea of where the kind of multimodal plugins to the roadway are going to take us, if that makes sense.
To be specific, we have Colfax West self-storage, and at one time, we've had this for many years. And one time they're talking about a median at our intersection. Well, that would just flat shut us down because we have moving trucks and so forth turning in, and any kind of a median there would put us out, and hamper our business very severely. So, we would obviously be very against that. So that's one corridor that we're talking about. And so I appreciate your consideration. And the other question I have while I've got the mic here is, there are 40 some people on this webinar here, whatever I call it. And I'm just wondering, how small of a segment do you go for input? What you're doing is going to impact thousands of people. And I hope it doesn't get to the point where you get a very small segment that is very vocal and the other people don't have an input, maybe because they aren't aware of what you're doing or what. And so these projects get guided by a small but extremely vocal group. And I've seen that happen. And I would hope that you would, put it really out to a very large public comments and input when you do get down the road and not just, listen to the loud people.
Well, we appreciate the loud people as well, but yes, you're very right. And we do know that these meetings aren't always convenient for everyone. People are getting home from work, eating dinner, taking care of kids, doing whatever they're doing at night. And we find that a lot of people watch the recorded presentations and then submit comments afterwards through Guiding Golden. So that is an option for people, as well as we're not assuming that everybody would be able to engage online either. So for example, I'll be dropping off hard copies of the presentation to the Golden Terrace community so that people can see that and leave comment forms and do things hard copy as well. we try to reach out to as many people as we can through the city and county and CDOT lists and newsletters and things, and in many different ways spread the word, but we're always happy for help on that. So if there's anything you can do to, if you'd like to put up flyers for us in the future, or if you could pass along our email notices to anyone else you know of, we're definitely always happy to get more people involved and looking for more ways to do that.
Certainly, we could probably help out to some extent at our office. Have some of the brochures with we've got close to 800 units, so deal with a lot of customers that are in the area, and also you have people that might rent from us that don't necessarily live there, but they use the corridor, which is convenient maybe to where their house or their businesses are. So that input, I think, would be important too. So any kind of flyers of that, we would sure look at distributing those.
That would be great. Ron, if you could send me a private chat with your email address, I'll make sure to correspond with you after this.
How do I do that? Where's your?
Down on the bottom toolbar, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should see a black toolbar pop up, and then the chat bubble will come up. And then you can pull down where it says to everyone and change it to be just to me, so that you don't have to share your email with everyone.
So how do I do everyone? Got that.
And then just pull down that little arrow right there by everyone, and choose Leah Langerman.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have a question or anything they'd like to add?
I had a quick question. Good to meet everyone. I'm new to the neighborhood. I wanted to know, you had shown one option, Hannah, where there was like trees and stuff like in between the road and the sidewalk, but I didn't see it as any of the options. Is that something that's like being considered in some of the areas, like if the space allows for it?
Yes, is the short answer. I'm gonna try going back. The amenity zone is what you're thinking. That guy, right? Is that what you were thinking? Yes. So this is something that we didn't necessarily ask people's preferences on, because we're assuming if there is space, that there would be a preference to have this. And we would add it as part of the cross section.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much. And then I know that this is like, I don't want to open up a can of worms because I'm sure this is way down the line, but as somebody who just moved from Denver and was like walkable to coffee shops and stuff, like I love the idea of like Launch Coffee and all the stuff that opened past the mine. I know that a lot of us drive over there. So I love that, these bike paths will open up access to what's already developed. But after this phase of the project, is that when you're going to talk about I don't know who you would compare what you want this area to look like. I don't know if it's like some of the Stapleton where like Ron, don't worry, they mix like the really good job of industrial and restaurant and pedestrian. I didn't know if like that's way down the line, or if you guys kind of had a vision, like, or any areas you would compare to what you're hoping that this can become.
I would, I guess, pitch that maybe to Rick or Corey, or Will, you're leaning into your camera. I don't want to cut you out.
Sorry, and then maybe we can kick it to Rick or Corey, but the South Golden Neighborhood Plan is in process right now, and like Tin Cup Ridge project, we're going to be coordinating with them. And part of the outcomes, and Rick and Corey know better than I, is a future vision of mixed use along this corridor with industrial and employment behind. So that's in process now, and maybe Corey or Rick could fill in a little more detail on that one.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. Corey.
Go ahead. Well, all right. We did sort of start a South Golden Neighborhood Plan effort last year, and we put it together as sort of a sub-area component of that plan that really focused on this corridor, and then also the Heritage Square parcel. And we took some initial feedback on sort of what types of land uses that the community would prefer along the corridor. And we got some initial feedback on that. That's what Will was alluding to. We're going to pick that process up again, I think probably next year, once we get sort of the transportation element squared away, which is largely what David Evans and Associates is helping us out with. So look for more of that soon. We got some initial ideas about sort of the broad stroke ideas of what people would like to see along the corridor, but we'll work to refine that and come back to the community. So I guess as a long-winded answer to your initial question, that is further down the road, but it is still coming.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And maybe just to answer the question, what future developments are coming? We don't have any developments that are in the queue, so to speak, just in the broad sense of we know development will happen in the future and we're planning for what those uses would be like. I guess the only one we know will redevelop in the future, in some sort of near-term future, in the next 5 years or so, would be Heritage Square, because we know that is looking for a new use at some point, and the city would be actively engaged in planning with the owner.
Cool. Yeah, and I mean, this project alone will help drive, right, like more development, I'm guessing, in the area, because there'll just be a lot more access to those types of businesses, right? So.
Right, that often happens with these kinds of investments, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
If Claire, or anyone else listening is interested, we do have a separate Guiding Golden page for the South Golden Neighborhood Plan. And there are summaries of the feedback that we received, both related to transportation, but also to some initial feelers for preferred land uses on Heritage Square. If you go to www.guidinggolden.com and look at the South Neighborhood Plan update page.
While we're on this this page here, I could mention that you're obviously on the call, so you heard about it somehow. But if you maybe just heard from a friend or something, if you haven't already joined the project mailing list, please send me an email or submit a comment, and that way I can keep you informed as we move forward and there are future engagement opportunities. We'll have another one of these online or public meetings happening towards the end of the year. So my email is there at the bottom of the screen. And I would encourage you all to sign up. Any other questions?
Okay. Gave it a good uncomfortable heartbeat and we might be good to go here.
Yeah.
I'll I guess wrap up quickly by just thanking everybody again for attending tonight and offering all the input and feedback and the really good thoughts. Like we've alluded to, we're going to grab all this stuff and start tearing into it and kind of absorb it and see where we take it. Don't be strangers. If you got comments or ideas, please get back to us for sure. I'll pause here for another second in case anybody else thought of something. Okay. Sounds like we are calling it a night then. Thank you, everybody. See you again soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.